Hi, I'm Aaron Sampson, and I've been a professional in the IT industry since 1995. With the primary focus on technical training, I can be found most of the time producing and delivering learning content centered around network infrastructure and services. I've also been involved with extensive practical implementations in a variety of operational capacities, including architecture and design, deployment and implementation, administration and management, and various other technology-based roles. As a computer technician, one of your main responsibilities is often to troubleshoot and diagnose hardware and display-related issues. In this course, I'll explore how to recognize and install various hardware and display components, including common hard drive types, replacement techniques, and migration processes. I'll also explore how to replace common components such as batteries and random access memory. Next, I'll cover physical privacy and security components such as biometrics and near-field scanner features, and you'll also discover how to differentiate between liquid crystal display types and explore organic light-emitting diode displays. From there, I'll explore several mobile display components and discover how to install and configure Wi-Fi antenna connectors, webcams, microphones, and laptop screen inverters. Lastly, we'll examine the common features of digitizers and touchscreens. This course will help to prepare learners for the CompTIA A Core 1 or 220-1101 certification exam. In this presentation, we'll introduce several of the primary components of a computer, beginning with random access memory, or RAM, which is also often referred to as system memory or even just memory. But one thing I'd like to clarify right off the bat here is the difference between memory and storage, because those terms are sometimes used incorrectly or even interchangeably in terms of context. So to clarify, storage refers to the hard drive of a computer, which can be thought of as a file cabinet because it stores all of the data for your computer, including the operating system, the applications that are installed, the configuration data, and all of your personal files. So, using that analogy, if the hard drive represents a file cabinet, then you can think of RAM as your desk. So forget computers for a moment and just imagine that I'm working with paper-based files. If I need a particular file, I'll go to the file cabinet, get the file that I need, and bring it back to my desk, and I'll work on it there. So in short, system memory represents what you're working on right now, but it doesn't just apply to files. For example, if you need to work in a word processor, then all of the files required to load that application are also retrieved from the hard drive and loaded into memory. But when that application is closed, those files are no longer needed, and they can be removed from memory and reloaded the next time they're needed. Now, that all said, memory is still physical hardware, just like a hard drive, but the primary difference is the architecture of that hardware. Most traditional hard drives use magnetic storage on a spinning disk, whereas memory is just a collection of chips with no moving parts. So accessing data from memory is very much faster than accessing it from the hard drive. But this is why you load the data you need from the hard drive into memory. While that data is in memory, it can be accessed very quickly. But the issue, however, is how much memory your system has. Again, coming back to the analogy of a desk, if your desk is very small, then working on many files at the same time is going to become more difficult. But if your desk is very large, then you can work on many files more easily. Back in the early days of computing, when the amount of memory in a computer was much lower than what we see today, if your computer was running slowly, you might have heard people suggest to you that you should install more memory to speed up your computer. While this was the net result if you did, that's not really the correct way to think about it. Rather, not having enough memory slowed your system down because your desk, if you will, was just too full at the time. So you were continually having to load data in and out of memory if you were trying to work on multiple files at once. Another key difference between memory and storage is that memory is volatile. meaning that it requires power to retain its data. So if the system completely failed or the power went out, whatever was in your memory was lost. Hard drives or storage are static. They don't require power to retain data. So that said, you might think, if it's possible to store data statically, why use volatile memory? Why not just make memory non-volatile? Well, in fact, you can, and this is the technology that's used for devices such as flash drives and solid-state drives. But to this day, for the RAM in your computer, non-volatile memory is still more expensive than volatile. Now, when it comes to laptop computers, it's still the same type of physical chip, but laptops, of course, are much smaller than traditional desktop systems. So the type of physical chip in a laptop is referred to as a small outline dual inline memory module, or SODIMM. A DIMM chip on its own would be what you'd find in a desktop. The small outline quite literally refers to the fact that it is a physically smaller chip due to the limited space within a laptop. They're usually about 2.5 to 3 inches in size depending on the make and model, with a varying number of pins and notches depending on the model of the laptop into which they're being installed. The pins are the actual point of contact with the system's motherboard, and the notches are to ensure that the chip is aligned properly and held securely in place. So I mentioned earlier how you could install additional memory into a system, effectively upgrading that computer. But you could either get more memory or keep the same amount but get faster chips, or in fact you could do both. But before you do so, you should always consult the motherboard documentation to confirm that the memory can be upgraded. Almost every system will allow you to do this, but if you're dealing with a very outdated system, I should point out that it can be difficult to find compatible memory modules these days. The specifications of individual memory chips change quite often, so be sure to determine how much you're currently using and the maximum amount of supported memory within that system. There are many vendors and manufacturers of memory modules, but in most cases it comes down to the specifications, and as long as they match, modules from different vendors can be used, and in most systems the capacity of each module does not have to match. For example, if your system currently has 2 physical modules, each one with a capacity of 2 gigabytes for a total of 4, but there are also 2 more available slots, then you could install 2 more chips of 4 gigabytes each for a total of 12. Now, when specifically upgrading or replacing the memory module on a laptop, first of all, turn off and disconnect the power supply so that you don't trip over the cord or pull the unit right off your desk or table. Then, in most cases, on the bottom of the unit, there is usually a door that can just be removed to access the memory. You might need a small screwdriver, or it might just have a release clip, but the memory module itself is usually inserted on a bit of an angle. Then just press down slightly to engage the clips that snap into place and hold the module securely in its socket. From that point, just make sure that all modules are seated correctly and securely, then simply replace the compartment door to complete the upgrade. So turning to video cards, these are the devices responsible for producing the video image and sending it to your monitor. Now, if you're talking about a desktop, then a video card really is just that. It's a card that essentially looks like a small version of a motherboard, but it sits in a slot on the actual motherboard and is usually held in place with screws or perhaps with clips, but it's a very replaceable unit. You could just remove the cover, take out the existing card, and install a new one if you are looking to upgrade. But in a laptop, you generally don't see a video card. It's usually built right into the motherboard, so it's not really a replaceable component unless you replace the entire motherboard. But most laptops also have external outputs so that you could send a signal to a secondary monitor or to a projector. But in most cases, this is just a secondary interface of the same card, but it depends on the make and model. Older model desktops often only came with a single video card with a single interface, so if you wanted to connect a second monitor, you had to install another video card. Some desktops, however, had an integrated video built right into the motherboard and a video card, in which case you could hook up a secondary display without needing an additional card. but the built-in interfaces usually didn't offer particularly high performance. These days, newer video cards offer very high performance and have multiple interfaces all on a single card. High-performance video cards are found most commonly on customized gaming systems or perhaps specialized graphic design systems. In terms of batteries for laptops, these generally are very replaceable, but you should always refer to the manufacturer's documentation to ensure that you get a compatible replacement unit. But in most cases, batteries are very easy to replace. Most laptops will have some kind of a latch or a release button, usually on the bottom of the unit, that releases the battery entirely. Then simply insert a new one into the existing compartment. In some cases, you may encounter a lid with a screw, but it would still just be a matter of removing the existing unit and replacing it with a new one. Just be sure to test the new battery first by powering up the laptop without the power cord to ensure that it's running from the battery. The CPU, or the central processing unit, is effectively the brain of your computer, and every computing device has some kind of CPU. As for upgrading or replacement, as always, you can consult the documentation for the specific make and model of your motherboard to determine if the CPU could be upgraded, but in many cases, replacement might be your only option. For example, in most desktop systems, you could usually replace the CPU if it was damaged or faulty, but it might not be upgradable. In other words, you could remove the old one, but you had to replace it with a new one with exactly the same specifications. In most cases, when a CPU is upgraded by the manufacturer, the physical size of the chip changes, so it simply wouldn't fit into the existing socket. This is by no means a rule, though. There were some CPUs that simply offered upgrades in speed, which could be installed into existing systems, but you just had to make sure that your motherboard supported it. In addition, some motherboards may have more than one physical socket, so a second CPU could be installed, but those were usually only found in specialized or higher-end computers such as network servers. If you can upgrade, then you may also have to adjust the configuration of your system to ensure that it realizes the increased capabilities of the new processor, such as its clock speed and the optimal operating temperatures to ensure the fan engages appropriately. The system board, or what's commonly referred to as the motherboard, is a replaceable unit, but this can be a complicated issue unless you are replacing a faulty unit with the exact same make and model. But even then, it's still an involved process because almost every other component needs to be removed before the system board can be taken out. In addition, if you're looking to upgrade to a newer or better performing motherboard, then this could result in having to buy all new memory, an entirely new CPU, a new video card, and several other components because the new board may not support your existing components. So, in truth, it's not a bad idea to consider replacing the entire computer before you replace the system board itself, and this is especially true if you're dealing with a laptop. That's not to suggest that the system board of a laptop can't be replaced, but in terms of the time, the effort, and the cost, it just might not be worth the investment. On that note, specifically with respect to laptops that is, the power connection or the DC jack may also warrant replacement of the entire laptop itself. Now again, that's not to suggest that a faulty DC jack can't be repaired, but in most cases it would require soldering to repair it, as the existing jacks are almost always integrated onto the system board. So you would have to desolder the old one and solder in a new one. And if you apply too much heat to the wrong area, you could damage the entire system board itself, in which case you're no further ahead. And finally, the body and or the frame for both desktops and laptops can be replaced. But again, check with the documentation first, especially for laptops. But the frame is the internal metal chassis where you mount all of the other internal components. And of course, all of your personal files will have to be backed up to a separate medium and restored after you have completed the fresh install. Now that all said, another option for migrating to a solid-state drive is cloning your old hard drive onto the new one. This is a very fast and easy option that uses specific cloning software, which will literally duplicate every single bit of data from the original drive onto the new drive. So no reconfiguration or backing up of data needs to be done. The source drive itself can also remain fully intact. Usage overall, because in general the increased cost of solid-state drives is mitigated somewhat by decreasing their capacity. In other words, traditional hard drives tend to have more storage capacity, so you could be using up more data on your existing drive than the solid-state drive can accommodate, so be sure to double check the capacity requirements. On that note, if you discover that you need to free up some space, you can certainly delete files that you no longer need or remove any old and/or unused applications. You could also install a fresh version of your operating system onto the new solid-state drive, make that the primary boot drive through your motherboard's BIOS configuration, and then keep your older hard drive as secondary storage for your personal files or applications so that data does not have to be transferred to the new drive. That said, if you want the performance gains of the solid-state drive, then you should likely just use the older drive for purposes such as backing up data or using it as an archive for very large or infrequently accessed files. Now, all of this certainly applies to a laptop as well, and upgrading a laptop to a solid-state drive can result in a significant boost in performance, but things could be a little more difficult when it comes to a laptop, since it's likely that you probably only have room for one drive, unless your laptop comes with a spare slot, which some models do. So in terms of cloning, you would have to have some kind of external housing to hold the target drive, which could require additional time and effort depending on the speed of your interfaces, such as the USB architecture, and you might also require additional tools and adapters to facilitate the data transfer. But once again, the increased performance of a solid-state drive would in most cases make these additional requirements well worth the time and effort. Lastly, a few other considerations with respect to cloning. If you don't have immediate access to the new solid-state drive, the cloning process itself can still be done. In fact, it can be performed at any time, and the resulting image can simply be stored on any kind of external drive or perhaps to a network server. Then once you have the new solid-state drive, you can just replace the old with the new, then restore the image that was created earlier onto the new drive. But just be mindful of how much time elapses between the original cloning and the restoration. Or perhaps more importantly, if any changes are made to the original drive after cloning. For example, if you clone the original drive on Monday in anticipation of receiving the new drive on Friday, but then you or someone else installs a new application or creates a new file on the original drive on Wednesday, then the cloned copy created on Monday, of course, will not contain the new application or file. So it won't be present when you restore the cloned image onto the new drive. So if you expect any kind of time delay, then just be sure that either no changes are made or that those same changes are manually performed onto the new drive after the image has been applied. but there will be differences in the physical units. Most notably, a laptop hard drive typically does not have any cable connections, and you usually don't have to remove the entire case to access the existing drive. In most cases, there is just a recessed compartment that is accessible from the underside of the unit. You might need to remove a screw to remove the compartment cover, but once you access the compartment itself, the drive usually just has a tab with all of the contacts on it, which slides into the slot that is built into the motherboard, which then makes all the connections, including the power. So it's in many cases a simpler process than replacing the hard drive on a desktop computer, but there may still be one or more screws that hold the drive in place. This ensures that the drive doesn't become disconnected from its socket, especially since laptops are much more prone to being dropped or bounced around, for example in the overhead baggage compartment of an airplane. Lastly, if you're replacing an existing solid-state drive, then it's important to know the form factor that you currently have to ensure that you're replacing it with a compatible type. On most desktops or laptops, it's usually a 2.5-inch form factor, which has become the standard for most devices, but for devices such as tablets or any kind of ultra-thin or mini device, you might encounter the M-SATA form factor or Mini Serial ATA. The ATA stands for Advanced Technology Attachment, which is only about 1/8 the size of the 2.5-inch. And in the smallest devices, you might encounter the M.2 or M2 form factor, which is often described as being about the size of a stick of gum. Again, these would only be found in devices that are very constrained for space, so it would be unlikely that you'd encounter them in a desktop or a laptop. Ultimately, before you proceed with the replacement, just be sure to verify what you have now and that your device Some desktop computers might have an internal architecture known as mini PCI. The PCI stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect, but it would be a slot that was fairly square in its shape, but the interface was directly mounted on the motherboard of the system and used a 124-pin edge connector, meaning that the device being installed was simply inserted into that interface. So as long as the device itself used the mini PCI architecture, it didn't matter what type of device it was. So you could install anything into that slot as long as the architecture matched. However, Mini PCI has been succeeded by Mini PCI Express, which is a 54-pin edge connection with a more rectangular shape, but the same rule applies. Any device using that architecture can be installed into that connector, and it should work. Another option is to use cellular connections, which allows you anywhere access to high-speed internet using the same type of cellular service that you have for your smartphone. Depending on the device, you might have mobile broadband connectivity built in, such as with some tablets, or it could be in the form of a USB stick that can be used across many devices, sometimes referred to as rocket drives or rocket sticks. You just plug them in like any other USB device, and in most cases your operating system will recognize and configure it automatically, and it will connect you to the same network provider that you use for your smartphone, or to whichever provider the adapter itself is subscribed. These types of connections are particularly useful for when there is no available Wi-Fi, such as when you're on a long trip in a car or a train, or outdoors, such as in a park or camping. As long as you can pick up on the cellular service, then you have access to the internet on that device. So as far as replacement is concerned, if it's a laptop, then always begin by turning off the laptop and disconnect all power, including the battery. Remove the wireless card compartment door if applicable, or just eject the existing card if it's using the PC card or express card architecture. Remove any mounting screws if present, and remove the adapter itself. Then insert the new device and perform all previous steps in reverse. On desktop systems, however, it's not uncommon for a wireless card to have an antenna. Because the desktop can draw more power and because they aren't as mobile, the antenna can help to increase the range of the connection. But if there is an antenna, then it's also likely removable. In most cases, it just screws onto a mount on the card itself. So simply detach the antenna, remove the old card, and install the new one, making sure to attach the new antenna if applicable. Then, of course, install any vendor-provided software or drivers and test the device to make sure it's working as expected. Again, I do want to stress that most newer systems these days, both laptops and desktops, will likely have most of these wireless connection types built in. Although cellular would generally be something that you would have to request, except for something like your smartphone, but many environments are still using devices that might only have some of them, or possibly none of them. But with these methods, their connectivity capabilities can certainly be expanded, which will likely translate into a longer lifespan for the unit itself, which can save your environment significant costs as compared to upgrading every single device. Is much less prone to interference from other radio sources as compared to Bluetooth. In short, each of these security measures and/or communication methods have their pros and cons, just like anything else, but they have all led to much more convenient access methods and easier methods of communication. Just always remember that no means of security is 100% effective, so it's still important to make sure that you remain diligent with your devices and protect your data as effectively as you can. In this presentation, we'll talk about LCD or liquid crystal displays, which have effectively become the standard for laptop computers and flat panel monitors, and most certainly have become the successor to the older cathode ray tube or CRT monitors, which used to be about the only type of display available for desktop computers if you go back about 20 or 25 years, primarily because they were very bulky and cumbersome by comparison to an LCD monitor. Typically, they were as deep as they were wide across, so they took up far more desk space, and larger monitors would be quite heavy as well, easily 4 to 5 times as heavy as modern LCD screens. So by the time LCD started to become more cost-effective, CRT monitors all but disappeared. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the younger viewers may not have ever seen a functioning CRT display. But the primary issue with LCD displays when they were first released was the cost. They were much more expensive than CRT monitors. But as the technology became more and more prevalent, the cost began to drop. And I would estimate that perhaps around 2005 to maybe 2007, CRTs were just about gone in most workplaces and even most home environments. Now, not only did the cost of LCD monitors come down, but the technology continued to improve as some early implementations suffered from distortions of the image based on the viewing angle, which still happens to a degree even today, but far less than what it used to. Today, LCD screens produce very high resolution and very clear images. They're cost effective and they take up far less space than their predecessor. Now, LCD is a technology that is based on using a liquid crystal material that is effectively sandwiched between two clear plastic sheets with a light source behind everything to provide illumination. The liquid crystal material is then divided into many small squares, each one representing a single pixel of the image. Each square in the display is independent of the others, and each is capable of 32-bit color depth, meaning that a total of 2 to the power of 32 colors can be displayed, which itself is a very high number, over 16 million in fact. But it's not just the total number of colors that help to produce higher quality images, it's the use of those colors to produce features such as gradients or transition, shadows, transparencies, and various other lighting effects that also improve the quality. These squares are more commonly referred to as pixels, as I had just mentioned a moment ago, which, by the way, is a contraction of picture element, in case you've ever wondered where that term originated. And the display resolution is generally referenced by how many pixels wide and how many pixels high the display can support. For example, you might see a display resolution listed as 1680 by 1050. This indicates that there are 1680 independent rows of pixels arranged across the screen from left to right and 1050 rows of pixels arranged from top to bottom. Now, you may also see values such as DPI, which stands for dots per inch, and it quite literally is just a count of how many dots, or in this case pixels, there are in a linear inch. But DPI is typically used more commonly with printed images as opposed to the resolution of your screen. The more applicable term with respect to a display is PPI, which is pixels per inch. In both cases, the more pixels that are used to create an image, the higher the quality you'll get. But it should be pointed out that there is a bit of a breakpoint, if you will. In other words, in terms of what the human eye can detect. At some point, increasing the PPI or DPI value for something like a saved photograph will really only have any visible effect if you greatly zoom in on the image. So if you're satisfied with the quality of an image, such as a photograph, increasing its DPI or PPI value will really only result in making the file larger. With respect to the background light source, all LCD screen types still rely on some kind of backlighting for their illumination. So there are two primary methods of providing that light, which are cold cathode fluorescent light, or CCFL, and light emitting diodes, or LED. CCFL lighting relies on a standard fluorescent light behind the display, but some models may use more than one to help produce more even distribution. But if there are multiple lights, then each one requires its own inverter, which converts DC power into AC. Now, as mentioned, this can help to produce more even lighting, but the more inverters you have, the more power the unit will draw, and the heavier it will be, and it might also produce more heat. By contrast, LEDs do not require inverters. They can run directly from the DC power of the motherboard and are therefore more efficient and environmentally friendly. The greater efficiency also means less energy waste in the form of heat. So the common question then is, why would anyone use CCFL over LED? Well, as is the case with many technological advances, CCFL was cheaper. But these days the cost of LED has dropped and has pretty much become the standard. Looking at some of the performance measurements for LCD monitors, the response time is a measure of how quickly any room, it means that many viewers spread out in different spots won't lose out on image quality. LCD screens can vary, but again, it does depend on the underlying technology. For example, as just mentioned, in-plane switching, or IPS, significantly improved upon this issue over technologies such as vertical alignment. And in fact, IPS has become the most prominent technology for LCD screens, so the viewing angle itself is much less of an issue these days than it used to be. Plus, you also have to consider the application. Several people watching TV spread The antennas certainly don't play a role in the quality of the display itself, but they are still components of the display unit. On a similar note, webcams are another component that have no direct effect on the display, but they are still often a component of the display. So again, if you're servicing the display of a device such as a laptop, you're also bound to encounter a built-in webcam. Most every laptop these days will have a webcam as a standard option, but some older models may not have one, so it will depend on the age of the unit. Now, despite the name webcam, many models also have a built-in microphone to handle the audio so that you can conduct video calls and conferences without any additional hardware. And of course, remember that if you are servicing a device with a built-in webcam, if you have to do any software reconfiguration, such as reloading the entire operating system, you will likely have to reinstall the driver for the webcam to restore its functionality as well. Lastly, like the webcam, there may also be a built-in microphone, also located in the display of your unit. Now, of course, we did just mention that if there is a built-in webcam, then it could have its own microphone also built in. But it will depend on the make and model. In some cases, the webcam and the microphone will be separate objects. Or there may be both a built-in mic with the webcam and a separate microphone that is dedicated for audio use. Again, it will depend on the model. If it is built in, it should be mentioned that it might not be in the display. In fact, it could be integrated into just about any part of the case, but the screen is still the most common because it catches your voice at the most direct angle, if you will. Particular to the motion of the wave means that you're going to take much more of a hit, if you will, and you'll most certainly be knocked right off your feet. If, however, you start to swim, now you're in a horizontal plane as well, and the wave will affect you far less. Likewise, the screen of your laptop is in the perpendicular position relative to the radio waves and can therefore catch much more of the signal. If the antenna was in the body, it would be in the parallel position relative to the waves, and the signal strength and quality would be much lower. That said, while the built-in antenna is obviously desirable both in terms of functionality and aesthetics, it is still a small wire that is shielded by the exterior case, which can result in poor performance. So in terms of mitigating those issues, there are some things that you can try, including installing an antenna booster, which is essentially just a much larger antenna can be installed. These give you several advantages, including portability. In other words, the device is not tied to a specific computer. They can be used on pretty much any computer, whether it's a desktop or a laptop, Windows-based or Mac-based or anything else that has an available USB port. And they often come with their own attachments or accessories, such as a tripod for mounting the unit or perhaps a clamp to mount the device on the top of your monitor. Also, in many cases, an external device could support higher quality than an integrated unit. Plus, they're relatively inexpensive and much easier to replace. more. But with digital information, it's all just a series of ones and zeros, which can be identically copied in theory an infinite number of times with no degradation at all. So any kind of digitizer simply performs the process of digitization, or converting analog information to ones and zeros. So back to the topic at hand, for a touchscreen, the digitizer accepts the analog information of where something like a stylus pen, or in most cases just your finger, is placed on the screen. The precise location is interpreted using standard X and Y coordinates, then those coordinates are passed to the digitizer to be converted into digital information, which can then be used by the processor to produce the desired output. These days, touchscreens are, of course, ubiquitous. Almost everyone has either a phone or a tablet or both, which are almost entirely controlled by a stylus or your finger, and it's essentially because of the digitizer that users can perform such operations as writing or drawing directly on their screens, or placing a cursor within a paragraph, select and highlight, copy and paste, or of course load an app. There are any number of